Hello, my friend. If you have been sitting at a desk, sitting in a car, or doing any of these other assorted daily life tasks, you might be wondering, how do I stretch this part of my body? How do I open my hip flexors? Well, in this video, we are going to look at what you need to know to stretch them out. Okay, so let's start by asking, what are the hip flexors anyways? What does that mean? Well, when we're standing and when I lift my knee forward, this action of the leg, drawing the knee in, is called hip flexion. So the hip flexors are a group of muscles that lay across the front of my hip and help to do that. So when these muscles contract, they pull my leg up. But the thing is that there's a couple different muscles that cross here. And we're going to look at one in particular today, which is called the psoas. So the psoas is a really interesting muscle because it connects the top half of our body to the bottom half of our body, and also the back of our body or the middle of our body to the front of our body. So this is a really interesting muscle. It attaches to the lumbar spine, to the bodies and to the transverse processes of the lumbar spine. And then it kind of slings down across the front of our hip and attaches into the lesser trochanter, which is the upper inner thigh here. Now, the psoas doesn't act alone. It's got a buddy called iliacus or iliacus, depending on who you listen to. Now, iliacus lies inside this big bony shelf here. So if you take your hands to your waist, go in and press down, you're going to encounter this kind of lovely rim of a bone. Now that is the ilium. If you take your fingers, and you may need to lay down to try this because sometimes these guys are tight, but if you soften your belly wall and tuck your fingers inside that bone, if you can get in there, you might feel some sensitivity. So iliacus lies on the inside of that bone, and then it jumps down and joins the psoas in connecting on the inner thigh. And together they help to hoist the femur up, and they also have some impact on the lumbar spine as well. So these are some pretty major hip flexors, and we have a couple other that we're going to talk about in just a little bit. But first, let's talk about how do we stretch these muscles? How do we stretch particularly psoas? So here's the thing about psoas. As we just discussed, it connects both to your ribs as well as to the front of your thigh. So with any of these hip flexors, if this is what contracts it and makes it shorter, then all I have to do is the opposite, to start stretching and opening it, right? So this is going to work. So remember iliacus, which is here, right? So this is going to work on these guys. However, notice what happens. As soon as you step your leg back, your pelvis tips forward, right? So if you try this with me, bring your hands onto your hips, right? Lift your left knee up. Now notice your pelvis here. This guy is straight up and down. As you start to bring your leg back, it starts to tip forward. Sneaky little bugger. And the reason it does that is because these guys don't want to stretch. They're like, no, thank you. I will just bring this part closer. Thank you very much. So in order to stretch the hip flexors, the first thing that we got to do is to step the leg back, but also to lift the pelvis up. So go ahead and bend your knee, lift the front of your pelvis up, and then start to stretch your back leg more to straight. And then you'll start to feel like, oh, now I'm starting to feel that. When your pelvis is tilted forward, you're not opening these as much, right? I have to lift the pelvis up in order to stretch across the front of this hip joint. All right, so that's step one. But if you remember, psoas, sneaky little bugger, attaches to the spine. So another way our body gets out of stretching is by sticking the lower back, like pulling the lower back in, right? Because if I do that, notice that these two insertion points, if one is here and one is here, if I let my back come forward, I bring them closer, right? And I decrease that stretch. So what we need to do is, one, bend the back knee, get the pelvis upright. Now take your hands to your waist. We're going to pretend that we're actually taking the front of the spine and pulling it back, right? You might start to feel that stretch already, like, hey, that increased something right there. Now, can you keep that? Can you keep the top tail of psoas, where it's supposed to be, right on your spine, as you now increase the stretch by straightening your back leg? And that, my friends, is the way to get a juicy psoas stretch. If I pop my ribs forward, I'm letting the top of psoas come closer to that second attachment, right? But if I pull my ribs and if I pull my spine back, I'm getting the maximum stretch from both ends of that muscle. Another thing you can do is squeeze your buttock. Your buttocks, squeeze your butt. When you squeeze your butt, it sends a signal to the front of your hip. If this is working, it sends a signal here to start to stretch. So that's another way that you can be helped to open up this front line of your hip. So thinking about yoga postures which could help stretch these hip flexors, let's remember I want to get the thigh back and I want to get my pelvis nice and lifted so I'm getting the maximum stretch here. Well, that's going to look like high lunge. It's going to do it for you. It's going to look like warrior one. It's going to look like low lunge. Even if I sink my hips forward and pull up, I can still get a nice stretch there. Hey, in my low lunge. It could look like saddle pose if I lean back far enough. Sitting up, no, you guys, these are connected, right? They're contracted. I'm actually flexing my hip. But if I go back and stretch my knees forward, then I'm starting to get a pull through the hip flexors and also the quads, which we'll talk about in a sec. So those are just some of the poses that you could use to stretch out your hip flexors, which really do love to stretch. So now we've talked about two of our big hip flexors, which are psoas and iliacus. But there's a couple of other muscles that also help to flex the hip, that is to pull the knee up, to pull the thigh up. And they are sartorius, which is a beautiful, long, graceful muscle, which runs from your hip point here to the inner knee. And it does actions like this, right? Dancers love it. And we also have one muscle that I want to talk about specifically called rectus femoris. Femoris of the femur, rectus being straight. Now, rectus femoris runs from, if you find that real knobby thing here, go just below it. It runs from there and it runs past your knee. And attaches right onto your shin bone, onto your tibia. So it crosses two joints. So that means if we want to stretch this sucker, then we're going to be thinking about both of these joints to get the maximum stretch. Let's just feel rectus femoris first, because muscles tend to get cranky if they are fully contracted. So go ahead and stand up with me. Lift one of your knees up. So what we're doing is we're flexing the hip. And now we're going to add in this activation of rectus femoris. We're going to add to it by straightening the knee. See how that's pulling these 2 points closer together? Oh, and you may feel a little bite in your thigh. It starts going, no, 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 no. That's because this nice long muscle is now at its shortest. I pulled it kind of as tight as I can in my own body. And it's like, I don't like that. Stop that. So that's what's talking to you right there. So if I want to stretch this guy out, I'm going to think about everything that we just did for the hip, like take the leg back, keep the pelvis down because it attaches here, but watch, this muscle goes all the way down below my knee. So to really add a stretch, I can bend my knee, right? So this is where we get into adding quad stretches, right? And you can really feel that muscle all the way up. So whenever you're adding a quad stretch in yoga, yes, you're stretching your quads, the 3 quads, but if you're also conscious of your hip, you can be stretching rectus femoris. So still keep taking your tailbone down so that your pelvis doesn't dump forward, and you can really stretch this guy too. So there you are, everybody. That is a quick introduction to your hip flexors. Specifically, we looked at the psoas, we looked at iliacus, and we looked at rectus femoris. And if you pay a little bit of attention to those guys every day, it's going to do you a world of good in terms of counteracting all of this kind of hunchy, driving, desking posture that we have. These guys don't just affect your hip here. Remember that psoas comes up and attaches to your spine. So by paying a little bit of attention to these guys, you're not only doing some good for your hips, but also for the upper body as well. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe for more tips. If you have comments or favorite stretches, please put them below, or any questions, and I will see you on the mat.